Ben, you ready?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's do it. Quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to please join me in a brief moment of silence to remember the Capitol police officers, Gibson and Chestnut, who were killed in the line of duty right here at the Capitol 20 years ago. Thank you. The committee is meeting today for consideration of H.R. 6374, the Fitness Information Transparency Act, H.R. 6265, the PreCheck Act, H.R. 6443, the Advancing Cybersecurity Diagnostics and Mitigation Act, H.R. 6198, the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Act, H.R. 6447, the Department of Homeland Security Chief Data Officer Authorization Act, H.R. 5869, the Maritime Border Security Review Act, H.R. 6400, the United States Ports of Entry Threat and Operational Review Act, H.R. 6439, the Biometric Identification Transnational Migration Alert Program Authorization Act, and H.R. 1005, Resolution 1005, directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to transmit certain documents to the House of Representatives to the border security policies, procedures, and activities as such relate to the interdiction of families by the U.S. Border Patrol between ports of entry. H.R. 6430, the Securing Homeland Security Supply Chain Act, H.R. 6459, the TSA Opportunities to Pursue Expanded Networks for Business Act, H.R. 6438, the DHS Countering Unmanned Aircraft Systems Coordinator Act, and H.R. 6461, the TSA National Deployment Force Act. The chair now announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled, and he may recess the committee at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. America's enemies are keeping us in their crosshairs. International terrorists are plotting and planning their next attack. Rogue regimes are pursuing the world's most dangerous weapons. Nation states and hackers are waging a war against us in cyberspace, and national disaster could strike at any moment. The American people are counting on us to make sure we are prepared to minimize and defeat these threats. This Congress, our committee, has set up a strong example to other committees to follow. Of the 99 bills that we have passed, 93 of them have passed both the House with strong bipartisan support. Because of this record, we were labeled the hardest working committee in Congress by Politico. Today, we have an opportunity to build on that success. This morning's markup will allow us to pass 12 bills that tackle many different security issues within our jurisdiction. One of these bills is from Congresswoman Lesko, her first piece of legislation to be marked up in the committee. Her bill requires DHS to conduct a threat and operational analysis of all U.S. air, land, and seaports. This analysis will guide a strategy and implementation plan to stop transnational criminal organizations and drug smugglers from transporting illicit drugs and contraband into the United States. We will also consider a bill that I've introduced to authorize the Biometric Identification Transnational Migration Alert Program system known as BitMap. This program helps prevent potential terrorists and dangerous criminals from entering our country. Our committee will mark up legislation from Congressman King that provides DHS with the authority to restrict the IT products if it determines that the vendor poses a threat to the DHS supply chain. Additional bills strengthen TSA and bolster cybersecurity will also be considered. I'd like to thank everyone who's worked so hard on these bills, and I look forward to working with each of you as we fight to keep our homeland safe. And finally, I'd like to recognize Mike Twincheck. At the end of this month, he will be leaving his position as chief clerk. Mike has been with the committee since it was first created and has served under chairman from both parties. And as chairman, I'm very grateful to have had him on my team. We should all be thankful to him for his service, and we wish him the best of luck. Thank you, Mike. And with that, I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today's markup comes at a disturbing moment in our nation's history. Last Monday, we saw a historic spectacle of an American president standing before the world audience, gleefully accepting Vladimir Putin's weak denial that he did not direct an attack on our democracy. Remarkably, despite having the benefit of seeing both the IC's evidence providing that election interference was Kremlin-driven and the indictment of 12 Russian intelligence officers, President Trump acquiesced to the Russian president. Ever since that day, the White House has been executing an all-out campaign to try and erase the memory of what we saw and heard, even as the president put out the welcome mat for Putin to visit in the fall. Suffice it to say, the campaign is not working. Instead, public sentiment is cementing around the view that the Mueller investigation must run its course to help answer what is behind the president's behavior toward Russia. The Trump administration is also unsuccessfully trying to erase its responsibility to reunify thousands of children who were taken from their parents by CBP as a result of President's ill-conceived and cruel zero-tolerance border policy. It is an outrage that the same administration that created this humanitarian crisis is now arguing in the courts that it should not have to reunify children with parents that it deported. This posture is all the more outrageous when you consider the substantial evidence that many of the parents that voluntarily withdrew their asylum claims and agreed to be deported only did so after being advised by DHS officials that it would help expedite a reunion with their children. Last week, members of this committee sat for 2.5 hours with officials from the Departments of Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, and Justice, and were fed excuses after excuse for why these children were still in federal custody. Today, with consideration of House Resolution 1005, members of this panel will have the opportunity to send a message to the Department of Homeland Security about our grave concern regarding how zero tolerance was rolled out and the damage it has done to vulnerable people fleeing violence. We must address family separation as well as a tactic that CBP is employing to interfere with the ability of people to exercise their legal rights to seek asylum at a port of entry. We must, as a co-equal branch of government, do our part and demand accountability from DHS. Today, with the consideration of my resolution and an amendment to be offered by Representative Barragan, we can do just that. What we should not be doing here today is permanently authorizing the bitmap program, which ICE continues to operate as a pilot, but whose efficacy as a counterterrorism program is unknown. Though the Trump administration credits the program with identifying many known terrorists, the little data that has been furnished to the committee, which is law enforcement sensitive, does not validate this assertion. Further, the timing is particularly troubling since under bitmap, partner countries collect biometric and biographical data from fleeing migrants as they transit through their countries to be shared with the U.S. Many of these migrants are the same people who, upon arriving in the U.S., had their children taken away by our government. Of the 13 bills before us today, I support positively reporting all but the bitmap bill. Before I yield back, I want to take a moment to talk about H.R. 5869, a bill to analyze the threats facing our maritime border. Though I do not believe the sponsor intends to do so, I am sensitive to the possibility that this bill could be used to launch unintended attacks against the Jones Act. As such, I'd like to clarify for the record that the intent of the bill is to look at threats of terrorism and criminal activity and what is needed for effective border security. On a related note, I'd like to submit a report in the record that has been called the first fact-based comprehensive report on the Jones Act since Hurricane Irma and Maria struck the island. Importantly, it was found that the Jones Act does not increase the price of consumer goods in Puerto Rico. Finally, on this, this is the last markup for Ms. Amani Gunn, who's participating in, before leaving us to begin an illustrious legal career. I'd like to express my sincere appreciation for her contribution to the committee's work. I understand she's going to Georgetown? Georgetown. Good luck. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. By agreement between the Chair and Ranking Member, the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member is recognized.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the Chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the Chairman.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to the use of an amendment roster. We've agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we shall take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. Chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Additionally, it is my understanding there is a bipartisan agreement on a number of bills and the amendments thereto. Accordingly, the Chair will be asking unanimous consent to consider these bills en bloc in the interest of time. Members with bills and amendments included in the en bloc will be recognized for a statement on the bill and amendment.
Thank the Chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 6374, H.R. 6265, H.R. 6443, H.R. 6198, H.R. 6447, and H.R. 5869 be considered. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 6347, H.R. 6265, H.R. 6443, H.R. 6198, H.R. 6447, H.R. 5869.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. Without objection, the respective subcommittees are discharged from consideration. The bills and amendments were circulated in advance. Printed copies made available. I ask unanimous consent that the amendments pre-filed and listed on the roster be adopted. Without objection, so ordered. Are there any other additional amendments to any of these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 6374, H.R. 6265, H.R. 6443, H.R. 6198, H.R. 6447, and H.R. 5869 as amended be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Without objection, Mr. Perry, Mr. Katko, Mr. Ratcliffe, Mr. Donovan may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation, and Ms. Jackson Lee, Ms. Watson-Coleman, Mr. Correa, Mr. Langevin, Mr. Payne, and Ms. Demings may each also be recognized for 5 minutes on their amendment. Does any member seek recognition? Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you want to go first? No, sure, okay. Sorry, I didn't even have coffee, and I'm ready to go here today. TSA currently screens more than 2 million passengers a day at airports across the country. As passenger volumes continue to climb, this number will only get higher, thereby further burdening TSA. In order to prevent this influx of passengers from dramatically increasing checkpoint wait times, which is not only inconvenient, but also a security vulnerability, TSA will need to increase throughput at checkpoints across the country. One method through which TSA could accomplish this is increasing the number of passengers who are members of trusted traveler programs like TSA PreCheck. Travelers pay a fee and undergo a background check to join PreCheck. Once accepted into PreCheck, travelers are recurrently vetted against databases and security indices. In exchange, PreCheck members endure less scrutiny at screening lanes, thereby increasing throughput. However, Because TSA has struggled to significantly increase PreCheck enrollment numbers, prompting the agency to divert passengers into PreCheck lanes through alternative methods, which have expanded the population of travelers who use PreCheck lanes, even though these individuals are not members of a trusted traveler program. That, in and of itself, creates a glaring security hole. This is concerning for several reasons. First, the passengers being put in PreCheck lanes via alternative methods like risk assessment or canine-enhanced screening have not undergone the same vetting as those travelers who have opted to pay and enroll in PreCheck. Furthermore, TSA is undermining its own efforts to increase PreCheck enrollment by simply giving away the use of PreCheck to non-enrolled passengers. This practice serves to sabotage enrollment expansion and sows confusion and resentment among the traveling public. TSA placing non-PreCheck passengers in PreCheck lanes is something that I and the committee have been trying to stop since I became subcommittee chair 3.5 years ago. Working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we have worked to end practices such as managed inclusion, using behavior detection officers, and risk assessment. However, TSA's current practices are not that much different than what we had back then and seen in the past. This bill will ensure TSA takes long overdue steps to preserve PreCheck lanes for their original intent, while improving PreCheck operations for all passengers. H.R. 6265, the PreCheck Act of 2018, seeks to address these challenges and restore the integrity of the PreCheck program and PreCheck screening lanes. My bill prohibits, with very narrow exceptions, travelers who are not PreCheck members from using PreCheck lanes at TSA checkpoints. The bill also directs TSA to conduct a pilot of risk-modified screening for low-risk passengers, which, if successful, should allow TSA to increase throughput at checkpoints while mitigating some of the vulnerabilities that exist with current practices. But to be clear, the risk-modified screening would not be for PreCheck lanes. Finally, H.R. 6265 requires TSA to act to increase PreCheck enrollment, as we have tried so many times in the past to get them to do. This will be a key to solving the long-term problem. Examples of these actions include partnering with the private sector to better market the program and adopting innovative technologies and solutions to make enrollment more accessible. I'll give you one quick example. In my airport in Syracuse, New York, we put a kiosk for PreCheck next to the security lanes, and now more than half the passengers flying out of Syracuse are in PreCheck, which is helping dramatically with wait times. In closing, PreCheck was designed to enhance security, not manage traffic at the checkpoint. The need to keep up with growing passenger volumes has caused the program to drift away from that purpose. I thank my friend and colleague, Mr. Keating, for being an original co-sponsor of this bipartisan legislation, as well as a ranking member of the subcommittee, Mrs. Watson-Coleman, for her leadership on this issue. Further, we'd like to thank the Chairman McCall for prioritizing this bill for markup, and Ranking Member Thompson for his prior leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support my bill, the PreCheck Act of 2018, which will address this serious security shortcoming and get the PreCheck program back to operating as it was originally intended. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I additionally want to express support for Mr. Katko's bill on PreCheck. This measure addresses a shared interest, ensuring that the PreCheck program operates as originally intended, to expedite known travelers and not as a tool for managing wait times. It seeks to move TSA in a positive direction by requiring TSA to pilot a risk-modified screening concept where screening could be provided at lanes in between PreCheck and standard screening lanes for passengers who have been screened by canines or otherwise assessed to possess a lower risk to security. To meet the requirements of this bill, TSA will need to continue to grow participation in the PreCheck program. Members on both sides of the aisle have been frustrated with TSA's lack of significant progress in providing new and creative enrollment opportunities, and we hope this bill will push them in the right direction. Before I yield back, I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Katko and express my appreciation for his focus on these issues and for working with Democrats to address concerns that we had with the introduced version of this bill. I would also be remiss if I did not acknowledge that this effort builds upon legislation that my ranking member, Mr. Thompson, advanced in the prior Congress. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady yields back, and Mr. Perry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6374, the Fitness Information Transparency Act of 2018, streamlines and consolidates the standards the Department of Homeland Security uses to vet the character and conduct of contractor employees, known as a fitness determination. This legislation is the result of a February 2018 oversight hearing where industry partners informed the subcommittee on oversight and management efficiency of DHS's costly and inefficient process to make fitness determinations. Currently, the Office of Personnel Management sets minimum fitness standards for all federal contractors. However, each DHS component can apply the criteria differently, creating disparate standards across the department. For example, a contractor employee who has been deemed fit to work for the Federal Emergency Management Agency may not automatically be deemed fit to work for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Many contract personnel support a variety of DHS components and may have to receive separate fitness determinations from each component, creating duplication and inefficiency. This not only delays the time a contractor can start providing necessary services to DHS, but because a contracting company builds the lag time into their bid price, this process also increases the cost to DHS and taxpayers. This legislation will require DHS to consolidate its varying fitness standards by creating uniform fitness requirements for each position risk level. By doing so, DHS will achieve department-wide uniformity and reciprocity of fitness standards, therefore eliminating the need for one contractor to undergo multiple fitness investigations. The FIT Act also reduces bureaucratic redundancies by allowing, when appropriate, the Secretary of DHS to deem someone who possesses a security clearance to also be considered fit to work for DHS. Moreover, my bill increases transparency into the fitness determination process by requiring DHS to provide monthly status updates to contractor representatives. It is important that DHS vet each and every contractor employee prior to working for the department. The FIT Act provides DHS the flexibility it needs to vet contract workers for its diverse missions while also making the process do more efficiently and transparently. I request unanimous consent at this time that a letter of support from one of the hearing witnesses, Ardent Management Consulting, be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Urge all members of the committee to support this common sense legislation, and I yield the balance.
Gentleman yields, and Ms. Jackson Lee is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I want to add my thank you to you and the ranking member. As much as we have strong and differing views of the governance of this nation, I want to express my appreciation certainly for the leadership of my ranking member and your leadership, and to speak with great sense of accomplishment. I hesitate to use the word proud that this committee has been touted as being the most bipartisan. It is certainly our work and challenge to secure this nation, and I think that is extremely important. Let me also join in acknowledging, as I was here on that day, many of us were in July 24th, 1998, in the tragic loss of Officer Chestnut and Detective Gibson. Continue to pray for their families. Let me ask unanimous consent that I may be added to HRES 1005 offered by Mr. Thompson, dealing with the resolution of inquiry on family separation, other related border security policies, procedures, and activities. I ask unanimous consent.
And without objection, so ordered.
And I thank him for his leadership. And Mr. Chairman, I would imagine that I could say in the hearts of both Republicans and Democrats, they know that the taking away of children was wrong-headed. And I just came back from 2 days at the border, and I want to personally say that there are people working at the border. They are my fellow Texans, and their heart is good. They want to do their job, and they've been thrown not a curveball but a brick right toward their literal heads, because all they can do is simply do what Washington tells them to do, including the National Guard, etc. And so they are in between and in betwixt, and they don't have the capacity to reunite these children. We actually watched reunification 4. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, as I said. The shock of it was that one 7-year-old couldn't recognize his parent because these are children. And it took a while for him to even get an understanding that this was his mother here, because I guess he had felt that he was going to acquiesce to what had been dealt him. this is long-lasting devastation to these children. So I frankly believe this resolution should pass, and I also believe that this administration should admit to its horrific error, horrible error. Let me, as I support H.R. 6374, I have an amendment, Fitness Information Transparency Act of 2018, and thank the author of that legislation. And as well an amendment to 5869 and the author of that legislation. And I will quickly indicate my amendments. My amendment to 6374 states that the Chief Security Officer may conduct an immediate review of a contractor employee's fitness determination when a contract employee is engaged in violent acts against individuals, property, or public spaces based on the contract employee's association with persons or organizations that advocate, threaten, or use force or violence or any other illegal or unconstitutional means in an effort to prevent others from exercising their rights under the Constitution or laws of the United States or of any state based on factors including, at a minimum, race, religion, national origin, or disability. I think we want our persons with these important responsibilities to be of the most integrity. We know that an individual who had a security clearance showed up at Charlottesville and was particularly offensive and racist, and I believe that it is important that we have this as an amendment, and I thank my colleagues for supporting it. Let me also indicate that I have an amendment, as I indicated, to 5869. I take note of the concerns expressed by my ranking member, but my amendment to the Maritime Border Security Review Act provides the committee with a report on DHS maritime border threat analysis based on the work that the agency is doing to secure the border. As a former member of the Border Security Committee and as well from a border state and with a number of ports all around my congressional district and my region, I think that security issue, as I visited the ports and the leadership there, both private and public, that is crucial to be transparent. So I'd ask my colleagues to support it. And finally, I'd raise the question that we've just been brought to our attention that there's some agreement at the State Department that allows the production of plastic guns through new technology, and that agreement has been in place. As I do the research, I hope that this committee will take up complete ire in any foolishness, because it impacts certainly travel, it impacts airports, aviation security, and we are at the end of our session here, going home for our working session. I'd call for a hearing on that as we return back to Washington. But I thank the committee for accepting my amendments, and I hope that we will pierce into by condemning, but also finding a resolution to the separation of these young children from their families, and never, never, never do it again. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Ratcliffe is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. As you well know, over my time as the chairman of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Subcommittee, the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, or CDM, has been one of DHS's top priorities because it has the potential to dramatically increase our visibility across federal networks. Many of us believe the program has the ability to provide the information necessary to make better decisions, not only to combat our enemies in cyberspace, but also to help federal CIOs manage information technology. This bill, H.R. 6443, will codify the CDM program at DHS to ensure that NPPD will have the necessary authorities to offer those essential cybersecurity tools and capabilities to our civilian agencies. Our goal in bringing this legislation is to boost the long-term success of the CDM program by ensuring that it keeps pace with the cutting-edge technologies and capabilities being developed in the private sector, and to avoid being locked into technology that will soon become outdated or unsupported by vendors, a complaint that many of us have heard far too often. The security data that CDM capabilities and tools collect will help federal CIOs and DHS to make smarter choices about where taxpayer dollars are going, and to better understand some of the most basic questions every cybersecurity official faces, including the most basic question: what are the devices on our network? There may be no better argument for H.R. 6443 and the CDM program than the findings and recommendations of OMB and DHS's Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination that was released just last month. OMB found that almost 75% of federal agencies are vulnerable to cyber threats, in large part due to their inability to understand cyber risks and therefore their inability to prioritize their resources. DHS's CDM program is the best solution to that problem. It's the best way to help federal agencies and the whole of the federal government to understand the threats they face and the risks that vulnerabilities pose in real time. Codifying the CDM program will further DHS's role in the cybersecurity mission throughout the government and give the newly confirmed Undersecretary of NPPD, Chris Krebs, the kind of ammunition that he needs to keep growing this vitally important program. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Longevin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to commend you and the ranking member for the work that's being done on this en bloc package and the overall list of bills that we have before us. I've always appreciated the bipartisan nature of this subcommittee, and I'm glad to see that work on balance continues. Mr. Chairman, the en bloc package includes an amendment that I've offered to H.R. 6443, Mr. Radcliffe's bill. And first of all, I want to thank and recognize Chairman Radcliffe's leadership on this, the Cybersecurity Subcommittee, and the work he's doing to strengthen our nation's cybersecurity. It's been a pleasure working with him over the years. So I'd like to, in particular, thank Mr. Radcliffe for introducing this legislation to codify the Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program, which is a critical part of the Department's efforts to protect federal networks. Despite its laudable design, the CDM program, though, has not been without its challenges, particularly the slow pace of adoption by DHS's sister agencies. So given those concerns, I'm glad this bill also requires DHS to develop a strategy that will force it to rethink how to address obstacles to the program's success. So my amendment requires that strategy to include recommendations for the timeline of future capabilities and whether or not to continue the phased delivery approach that has been the hallmark of the CDM program. During our March oversight hearing on the program, I requested whether the phased approach remained the best way forward. In particular, many elements from Phase 3 and 4 do not require serial implementation. So if the Department truly believes that the phased delivery is best, this amendment will afford them the opportunity to make that case. If, on the other hand, the limitation is one of personnel and resources, Congress needs to know that as well. So the recommended schedule in the CDM strategy will help us keep DHS accountable for getting these cybersecurity tools onto federal agencies' networks as quickly as possible. In addition, the en bloc package includes two of my amendments to Mr. Carter's bill to create a chief data officer at DHS and in each of its components. So in recognition of the CDO's role, my first amendment would make the DHS Secretary, rather than the Department's Chief Information Officer, responsible for appointing the Chief Data Officer. This change would be consistent with Speaker Ryan's Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2017. Also, to encourage greater coordination between the components in DHS headquarters, my second amendment would require component head to consult, each component head to consult with the Department's Chief Data Officer and their own Chief Information Officer when appointing an agency CDO. We live in the information age, Mr. Chairman, and data is already being termed the new oil. So these changes will help bring more cohesion to the Department's data policy activities, and I urge support for them. With that, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Donovan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. The Department of Homeland Security was created in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks and the threats to the homeland posed by al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. Since that time, the scope of the threat has changed dramatically. It has become much more diverse. We know that the terrorist groups have long strived to employ chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear materials in their attacks, and we have seen chemical weapons used in the battlefield. The Secretary of Homeland Security reviewed the Department's organizational structure and determined that it was not optimally organized to address these threats. As a result, on October 6th of last year, she notified the committee of her intent to use her 872 reorganization authority to establish a Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction, or CWMD, office headed by an Assistant Secretary for CWMD. This reorganization took effect last December. However, the Secretary realized that the use of her 872 authority would only take her so far, and legislative changes are necessary to fully integrate the CWMD office. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute we are considering today, will take the Department the rest of the way in developing an integrated, effective organization to counter chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. The bill seeks to ensure the Department of Homeland Security has the structure, authority, and tools it needs to counter the threat of weapons of mass destruction. It consolidates the Office of Health Affairs and the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office into the new Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office to ensure coordination and unity of effort at the Department of Homeland Security on these threats. The bill also includes the text of the Securing the Cities Act, which authorizes the Securing the Cities program to provide assistance to urban areas to counter radiological and nuclear threats. The Securing the Cities Act passed the House last year. I am thankful to the Department of Homeland Security for their partnership in this effort. The Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee, which I chair, has held hearings, classified briefings, and discussions with the Department officials this Congress, all of which have contributed to this legislation. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute we are considering today, is similar to the intent to the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Defense Act, which passed both the committee and the House by voice last Congress. I urge all members to join me in supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute. I thank the Department of Homeland Security for the input here, and I thank my colleagues for their support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and before I go to Mr. Payne, Mr. Katko has a brief unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Global Business Travelers Association in support of H.R. 6265. I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Payne's recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see. The Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Act of 2018 essentially codifies the actions that DHS undertook in December 2017 to alter how it was organized to prepare for and respond to biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear threats. Having done oversight of how the new Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office is operating, I'm pleased to support this authorizing legislation. That said, it is improved with the addition of my amendment, which makes plain our expectation that the new office coordinate with the Science and Technology Directorate, S&T, on research and testing activities. As many of you may know, DHS's S&T Directorate performs key work in developing technology to respond to a wide range of Homeland Security threats. My amendment ensures that as this new office continues to carve out its identity within DHS and the federal government, it prioritizes coordination with the S&T Directorate to ensure that scarce research and development resources can be leveraged. Additionally, such coordination is essential to ensuring robust lines of communication as both entities execute their related missions. I thank my colleagues for joining me in supporting this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this month, ProPublica and Frontline released a report which found that a defense contractor with Northrop Grumman was an affiliate of a violent white supremacist group. The employee who held a government-issued security clearance was a member of the Rise Above movement, a racist and violent group that has expressed hatred for African Americans, Muslims, Jews, and immigrants. The employee, who has since been fired from Northrop, was caught on video violently attacking a counter-protester, punching the peaceful demonstrators several times during the Charlottesville rally. While I would note that the security clearance is different from a fitness determination, it is related. Both investigative processes assess the character and the conduct of the individuals. Both processes should ensure that affiliation and of membership with a hate group prevents employment with the federal government. Whether derogatory information about this Northrop Grumman employee came up during his investigation is unclear, which is why I am offering this amendment. My amendment requires DHS to provide Congress with an annual report detailing the number of individuals who receive an unfavorable fitness determination due to their affiliations with or membership of an organization dedicated to foreign or domestic terrorism. The amendment also requires that the number of individuals who receive a favorable determination despite such affiliation or membership be shared with Congress. This committee has an obligation to ensure that DHS is positioned to protect our communities from terrorism, be it domestic or foreign. We cannot have individuals with terrorist affiliations inside the department. And I thank my colleagues for accepting this amendment. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered at this time.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes to give a statement on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this legislation that requires DHS as a secretary to issue a uniform set of fitness standards for vetting contractor employees. Earlier this year, our subcommittee held a hearing in which we received troubling testimony about how long it takes for contractors to be on board at DHS. Witnesses shared disturbing accounts of redundancies in the determination process and the frustration with the overall lack of transparency on the status of applicants moving through the process. Witnesses also expressed disappointment with the lack of reciprocity among components of the department. While I'm pleased that the bill addresses these issues as it relates to contractor workforce, I am offering an amendment to bring focus on these same issues that exist within the federal applicant pool. It's no secret that the federal government is constantly competing with the private sector to attract the next generation of the best. For that reason, I believe that we must seize this opportunity not only to streamline onboarding processes for contractors, but also to address the parallel struggles that exist within the federal applicant pool. I want to thank Chairman Perry for his work on this measure and for working with me on this amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. H.R. 6447 requires DHS to designate for the first time a Chief Data Officer for the department and within each component. My amendment delegates responsibility for overseeing implementation of the Data Quality Act to these key officials. In this season of alternative facts, it is critical that we have vigilant watchdogs in this area. The Data Quality Act requires federal agencies to issue guidelines to ensure or maximize the quality, objectivity, utility, and integrity of information, including statistical information they disseminate. Additionally, it requires agencies to establish mechanisms that allow persons to seek and obtain correction of information that does not comply with the guidelines. Remarkably, in 2006, GAO reported that DHS was the only cabinet-level agency to not have department-level guidelines in place. More recently, in 2015, GAO highlighted DHS's failure to include any information on its website about requests to correct erroneous information. If we just consider DHS's past deficiencies in meeting the Data Quality Act, we could conclude there is a need for my amendment. But when you overlay DHS selectively using data to support President Trump's false immigration claims in order to promote his zero-tolerance policy, the case is compelling. Arguably, the most notable example of this troubling behavior came in January of this year when DHS released a report purporting that its data showed that 3 out of 4 individuals convicted of terrorism were foreign-born. However, that conclusion was based on incomplete and misleading data, not least of which was excluding data on homegrown violent extremists. Later that same month, the Secretary of Homeland Security testified that 90% of unaccompanied children released never show up for court. However, the Department of Justice data indicates that the number is not 90%, but closer to 32%. The President's administration's repeated practice of disseminating inaccurate and incomplete data to influence public opinion on immigration undermines our ability as a nation to have a free, and remember this word, fair debate. I would remind my colleagues of the cautionary statement issued by the Office of Management and Budget that explained the need for the Data Quality Act back in 2002. In it, MOB stated that the fact that the internet enables agencies to communicate information quickly and easily to a wide audience not only offers great benefits to society, but also increases potential harm that can result from the dissemination of information that does not meet basic information quality guidelines. I thank my colleagues for joining me in sending a strong message of support for accurate information and seizing this opportunity to establish a network of internal watchdogs to help the department reform its ways and be compliant with the Data Quality Act. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields. I now call up H.R. 6400, the United States Ports of Entry Threat and Operation Review Act. The bill is circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6400.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point, the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States has over 300 official ports of entry. It is imperative that we know the vulnerabilities and operational needs at each of them so we can properly protect our homeland from potential threats and exploitations. My bill requires the Department of Homeland Security to do a full threat and operational analysis of these vulnerabilities and create a strategy and implementation plan to prevent human trafficking, illicit drugs, contraband, and transnational criminal activity at our air, land, and sea ports of entry. This bill also works to improve the flow of commerce, which is vital to our economy. I introduced this bill because our country's ports are long overdue for a comprehensive review. Ports of entry continue to be a preferred location for transnational criminal organizations and drug smugglers to transport illicit drugs and contraband into the United States. In fact, between October 1st, 2010 and March 31st, 2018, Customs and Border Patrol conducted more than 84 million non-intrusive inspection examinations, resulting in more than 19,000 narcotics seizures and 79 million in currency seizures. According to the DEA 2017 Threat Assessment, the most common method used to traffic illicit drugs in the United States is in passenger vehicles with concealed compartments or commingled with legitimate goods on tractor vehicles. In fact, former Department of Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly stated in a hearing before Congress that the big issue right now with drugs coming into the United States is at the ports of entry. Not only do we need to think and look at the security aspects of our ports, but their infrastructure too. Many U.S. ports of entries were built 40 to 50 years ago. Therefore, they were never designed for post-9/11 security measures, technology, or increased volume of traffic. These infrastructure constraints magnify the threats at our ports of entry and manifest themselves as long lines and bottlenecks that strain Customs and Border Protection's ability to properly vet all incoming traffic. In addition, long lines and wait times delay trade and cost the U.S. economy millions of dollars every year. This is why my bill's required analysis will include an assessment of these security and operational gaps. It will look over current and potential threats, methods, and pathways used to exploit security vulnerabilities, and improvements needed to prevent illicit drugs and other contraband from making it across the border. It requires the Department to consider improvements needed to enhance travel and trade facilitation and reduce wait times, as well as staffing, technology, and infrastructure needs and their estimated costs. It is clear we need more advanced technology and infrastructure to improve our vetting and combat fraud. My bill requires that after the analysis is complete, the Department of Homeland Security creates a strategy and implementation plan to address the threats and operational inefficiencies outlined in the analysis. The contents of the strategy and implementation plan will ensure the Department takes a well-thought-out, comprehensive look at all ports and all issues relating to both threats and operations. I want to thank the Chairman and my fellow committee members for their support on this important legislation. Neutralizing the threats at our ports of entry is just one step in securing our border. I urge my colleagues' support, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Per the roster agreement listed first is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Vela, would the ranking member like to offer the amendment for the gentleman?
Yes, I would, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer Mr. Vela's amendment, who is somewhere circling Reagan National Airport trying to get in.
That's unfortunate to hear. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6400, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I support H.R. 6400, the United States Ports of Entry Threat and Operational Review Act. That said, this amendment seeks to improve the underlying bill by refining an aspect of how department carries out its ports of entry analysis. The bill requires a review of process conducted at ports of entry that could be done by non-law enforcement staff, the private sector, or automation. This amendment seeks to clarify that when the Department of Homeland Security carries out this review, it must comply with the Federal Activities Inventory Reform Act of 1998, or the FAIR Act. The FAIR Act sets forth a process whereby an agency can determine which activities it's performed are inherently governmental or so intimately related to the public interest as to require performance by federal government employees. Such activities like searching vehicles at a port of entry may not be contracted out to the private sector. The FAIR Act applies to every executive agency, including the Department of Homeland Security. Approving this amendment would ensure that there continues to be a uniform standard applied within the department. As such, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment offered by Mr. Vaylor. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the Avail amendment offered by Mr. Thompson. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Next amendment on the roster is offered by Ms. Berrigan of California. Would the gentlelady like to offer her amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered at this time.
Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6400, offered by Ms. Berrigan.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6400 directs DHS to produce an analysis and strategy to mitigate known threats and challenges in our ports of entry. My amendment would enhance the bill's proposed analysis and strategy by requiring meaningful action to better manage and facilitate the lawful movement of people at our ports of entry. Over the last few months, I, like many other Americans, have been horrified by the damage the Trump administration's cruel and unjust zero-tolerance policy has done to families. It created a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which this nation has never seen. There were thousands of children who were forcibly separated from their parents by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and sent, in many cases, to opposite ends of the country. Although the family separation policy has technically come to an end, this administration continues to display callousness toward migrant families seeking safe harbor for themselves and their children. Last week, more than 200 declarations were filed from children and parents detained by Border Patrol in the Flores versus Sessions case. These statements paint a picture of what can only be described as inhumane conditions: inadequate food and water, sleep deprivation, and verbal or physical assaults. Since the zero-tolerance policy went into effect, the Trump administration has repeatedly stated that the only way to seek asylum is at a port of entry. However, reports have emerged of asylum seekers being turned away or forced by CBP to wait for days at the ports of entry in order to be processed. My amendment seeks to guarantee that CBP end an administrative line management process known as metering, which has been used by CBP to manage larger flows of asylum seekers at the San Ysidro port of entry. Now, the origins of this practice date back to 2016, when CBP officers at the San Ysidro port of entry struggled to manage a sudden influx of more than 1,000 Haitian asylum seekers. They used a temporary number system coordinated with Mexican officials to hand out appointment dates with agency officials. Asylum seekers without appointments were turned away. Unfortunately, under the Trump administration, this practice has morphed into something more like deliberately obstructive by either turning away asylum seekers or dissuading asylum seekers from pursuing their claims. In July, the CBP commissioner testified before the Senate that there are over 1,000 people waiting on an average 7 to 14 days in the hot California sun before they are allowed into the port of entry to assert their asylum claims. We appreciate that there may be surges in daily traffic that stress CBP's resources, but CBP has an obligation to use systems that are fair and that do not interfere with people's ability to seek asylum under our laws. My amendment enhances the analysis proposed in H.R. 6400 to include a study of which improvements are needed at our ports of entry to stop the use of metering to lawfully manage the lines of people trying to cross our border and facilitate the legal entry of people into the United States. My amendment would also require that the port of entry strategy and implementation plan include efforts to prevent the use of metering and facilitate the lawful movement of people through ports of entry. Whatever our views are on asylum and refugees, we should all be able to agree that the lawful movement of people should be facilitated and encouraged through our ports of entry. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Lesko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I respectfully oppose the Berrigan amendment. I don't believe the amendment furthers the cause or the purpose of the bill. I also think that no matter what the intent is of the amendment, that it will create mass chaos at our ports of entry. I ask my members fellow members to oppose the Berrigan amendment and support the underlying bill with the Vea amendment. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Lady yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Jackson-Leigh.
I rise to support the gentlelady's amendment and would make the pointed and informed argument, having just left the border and CBP and discussed with those officers, is that there is no problem to have individuals steered toward the port of entry. And the law is that if they come into the port of entry, that they are not then declared a felon, because you have the right to request asylum. And as we stood on the bridge, we watched our officers in a very professional manner discern those who wanted asylum, and they quietly waited until the line had gotten in a way of processing others, because the port of entry does have individuals with papers and business and shopping and any variety of things. This is at the Texas-Mexico border, which is very busy, and they appropriately had the individuals at that time, 3 people seeking asylum, to come into the port of entry, of which our CBP could do the appropriate, extensive, and detailed review of these individuals and process them to move to the next level for their claim of asylum. And frankly, the pictures that we saw previously was because, as I indicated in my early remarks, when Washington dumps a wrong-headed policy on these hardworking Americans who want to serve their nation and want to protect the border and protect the nation, then, and without the funding and staffing that they needed, they had some horrible logistical issues. And of course, there was frustration and tensions and a number of the things that we saw, the untoward actions of individuals sitting for 2 weeks came about. And I don't excuse that. But in seeing it after that, even though there were lines, there was an orderly process that going to the port of entry would not stress the system. It would be an orderly process and an appropriate process to not demonize and encourage illegal crossings. I think the gentlelady is saying let's encourage an orderly crossing that would in fact be legal, whether or not they were given or denied asylum. That's really what America is about. And although the Statue of Liberty is not at the southern border, the concept is similar. And as we know, that many immigrants have helped to build this nation. So I think the gentlelady's thoughtful amendment is worthy, and from a firsthand visible view in the last 48 hours, there is no conflict or divide between what the gentlelady is offering in her amendment and what can be done at the border, in particular the border that is on the southern border. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion? Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, metering is an effective way to ensure the safety of all individuals entering our country. And although I hold my colleagues across the aisle in the greatest esteem, this amendment would endanger all parties, including Customs and Border Patrol officers and those seeking asylum or refugee status. And let me state that America is well aware, every member of this committee is well aware, that refugee status and claims of credible fear status have been extended in good faith to those who cross our borders in America. And yet we know very clearly and factually that those crossing our southern border primarily illegally have been well schooled on exactly what to say. So the requirement to vet those that request asylum has enhanced by their own abuse of that system. And let me remind my colleagues that last October, Democrats on this committee were not concerned with this issue when we marked up H.R. 3548. the Border Security for America Act, which authorized funding for expanded port of entry capacity. Not one Democrat voted in favor of that bill. Our facilities were not designed to process hundreds of asylum seekers at one time, and to do so within existing facilities would compromise the safety of all involved, including those crossing our border. We must enable to control the environment of ports of entry. This amendment, regardless of its intent, would cause chaos at our ports, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? Ranking members recognized.
Just for the record, Mr. Chairman, metering is not the issue. It's the zero tolerance policy that precipitated what we have. I don't think there's any question about our interest in securing the border, but asylum is not guaranteed. But to deny people the right to request it, I think, is the issue. And whatever the vetting procedure for asylum seekers is, there's no effort to weaken it on our part. We just want to make sure that we don't deny, even if somebody's been coached. I believe in our system of vetting people who request asylum. Nobody has indicated that that system can be compromised. There are a number of checks and balances, as we heard in our briefing last week, that individuals who request asylum go through. Not one time did we hear that somebody, because of this coaching, has been successful. So I think, for the record, the men and women who are tasked with the responsibility of validating asylum seekers are doing a good job. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Berrigan. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
The recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. I now call up H.R. 6439, the Biometric Identification Transnational Migration Alert Program Authorization Act of 2018. The bill is circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6439.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. The terror attacks on 9/11 made clear that we need to strengthen our information sharing. It needed to be stronger among our law enforcement and intelligence agencies, but also with our international partners. As terror threats evolve over time, our adversaries become more agile. They are desperate to avoid detection and sneak into our country. While testifying before our committee last month, Secretary Nielsen stated, on average, my department blocks 10 known or suspected terrorists a day from traveling or attempting to enter the United States. We know that one of the ways they try to come here is through the exploitation of illicit pathways in South and Central America. To combat this threat, we need to leverage our international partnerships and use the most advanced technology to our advantage. One of the best programs we have for this is ICE's Biometric Identification Transnational Migration Alert Program, known as BitMap. BitMap was created in 2011 by the Obama administration and is utilized throughout the world. Throughout this program, law enforcement officers in participating countries collect biometric and biographic data on special interest individuals. That valuable data is then shared with our own law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies. This enriches our intelligence community databases with new and vital information. In the last few years, BitMap has identified several hundred known or suspected terrorist. While highlighting the importance of bitmap, former Acting Director of ICE, Thomas Homeland, stated to us in May that people, quote, people that were known terrorists have been turned around in Panama and sent back before reaching our shores. Bitmap has already proven successful. Bitmap does not just target suspected terrorists, however. It also identifies drug smugglers, human traffickers, murderers, child predators, and dangerous gangs like MS-13. My bill will fully authorize Bitmap and help identify national security threats. Simply put, it will help stop dangerous individuals who want to bring harm to the American people from entering our country. I look forward to passing this legislation out of this committee and continue our efforts to secure the homeland. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Is there any further discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Keating is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for holding this markup today. The bills before us will make a substantial improvement, I think, on our security across various areas. I particularly want to congratulate the Chairman for introducing H.R. 6439, of which I am the Democratic lead co-sponsor. The bill codifies the Biometric Identification Transnational Migration Alert Program, or BITMAT, that's been in operation since 2011. This program has proven to be extremely useful in increasing our capacity for information sharing and developing comprehensive strategies with our international partners to catch known or suspected terrorists and criminals before they reach our borders. Through this biometric identification program, we provide capability to our foreign partners to tactically collect biometric and biological data on persons of interest they encounter. If such individuals are identified as threats to the United States national security, Homeland Security investigations and our U.S. government partners work with host nations to take appropriate law enforcement action at that time. In addition, bitmap collections bring individuals of interest to our attention so that we can prevent them from acquiring visas and stop admission to the United States at future encounters. This program has also been used in collaboration with the Department of Defense through U.S. African Command. In 2012, personnel from AFRICOM supported by our Homeland Security investigations, conducted an initial bitmap operation in Kenya and other areas in the South Sahel. With agreement and support from Kenyan Ministry of Internal Security, the newly trained HIS special agents trained select Kenyan law enforcement personnel who later deployed along migration routes to conduct biometric collections. A milestone for BitMat in Africa was reached when Kenyan law enforcement submitted data successfully through the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI national databases, and thus effectively established a new biometrics operating model for AFRICOM. This program is effective and serves as a useful tool for our national security apparatus as well as our allies. I believe this piece of legislation will only strengthen this program, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 6439 would make permanent an ICE pilot program known as a Biometric Identification Transnational Migration Alert Program, or BITMAT. BITMAT was launched in 2011 to partner with foreign countries to collect biometric and biographic information on foreign nationals migrating through partner countries. This collected information is then checked against U.S. terrorism databases in an effort to identify threats and stored in the U.S. databases for an unspecified amount of time. My colleagues know well that I support smart and effective border security measures. I've long supported and will continue to support the Department's effort to push out our border. For instance, CBP's pre-clearance program and ICE's visa security units are successful examples of mature overseas programs that improve our screening and vetting operations while keeping Americans and our border safe and secure. But BITMAP efficacy, as known as a counterterrorism program, is not yet known. Despite having started 7 years ago, the volume of data captured only began to be significant in 2016. Details of the program are law enforcement sensitive and cannot be shared publicly, but from what the little we have, we are not in a position to say that it is properly tailored to be an effective counterterrorism program. Before leaving the Trump administration, like the chair said, Acting Director Tom Homeland hailed Bitmap as one of ICE's greatest tools in preventing thousands of terrorists from ever reaching our borders. Yet, ICE has not been able to provide data to back up this statement. We still have basic questions about the program, such as how does ICE determine which countries to partner with? We don't have that. After the terrorism database checks, what does the government do with the thousands of records it's collected on migrants? We don't have that. How many actual known terrorists have been identified, and what did we do about it? We don't have that information. What, if anything, does ICE do to limit or prevent the collection of information on migrants who are nowhere near our borders and may have no intentions of entering this country? We don't have that information. Because of the many outstanding questions on this program, I cannot support its permanent authorization at this time. If the committee fails to pass the bill today, it will have no impact on ICE's ability to continue the pilot and address the critical oversight questions I highlighted. I'd also note that this bill is coming at a time when there is a high level of mistrust toward the Trump administration and its handling of migrant families. It stands to reason that many of the people whose biometrics were collected in this pilot were then subjected to the Trump administration's cruel and inhumane zero-tolerance policy and had their children taken from them by the U.S. government. Last week, the administration reported that 2,551 children ages 5 to 17 are still in custody. It is now plainly obvious that this administration began separating these children without any plan to link them to their parents or any plan for reuniting them. Before considering yet another enforcement-heavy bill, Congress should consider bills such as the Keeping Families Together Act by Congressman Nadler to end family separation for good. One day, Bitmap may prove to be an effective program worthy of authorization and full support of this committee, but today is not that day. As such, I must oppose this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Bacon's recognized.
Real brief comments, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I strong support for Bitmap and for H.R. 6439. It's going to make our country safer. Will help safeguard our citizens from terror. We've been collecting biometric data in the Middle East for over a decade. When we catch a Sunni extremist in Iraq or Afghanistan, that data is collected. Some of those subsequently, because of our withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, were released, but many of those members are still active in Sunni extremism and could be coming here. We've been doing this data in Africa. Now we're doing it with our partners in South and Central America. It's important to bust down these silos so that we get the synergy of this data collected. And I talked to a recent ambassador from one of our friends in Central America. He said they have captured 49 or interdicted 49 Sunni extremists that were on the way here. And by the way, they didn't come with their real name. They had false identities. Biometric data does not lie. I think this is a great program that we need to build upon. It will create synergy in our efforts with our allies in 3 different continents, 3 different commands, and I strongly support the bill. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Let me just say that I know ICE has been in the headlines quite a bit these days, but I would not want to use that to stop a program that has worked in identifying dangerous actors and keeping them out of the United States. In fact, it wasn't that long ago, the acting ICE director said that people that were known terrorists have been turned around in Panama and sent back before reaching our shores. Bitmap has already proven successful. It's already proven that people who want to do harm to this country have been stopped on the way rather than on the border or inside the United States. To me, that's pretty compelling. I think this is a program worthy of authorization. And with that, there being no further discussion of the bill and no amendments on the roster, does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 6439. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the bill is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous agreement. This vote will be postponed. I now call up House Resolution 1005, directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to transmit certain documents to the House of Representatives relating to the border security policies, procedures, and activities as such relate to the interdiction of families by the U.S. Border Patrol between ports of entry. The resolution was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
H.Res. 1005.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Resolution is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Ranking Member Thompson is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I introduced this resolution in response to the Trump administration's continued failure to provide Congress with necessary information regarding the effects of its implementation of the zero-tolerance policy on migrant families. Thanks to the ACLU for filing a lawsuit, we finally got some of the numbers. Other than that, those numbers would not have been forthcoming. Since May, widespread enforcement of this cruel policy has led the CBP to separating thousands of migrant families. As I said, fortunately, the courts have intervened and ordered the Trump administration to reunify all the families it separated by this Thursday. However, today, there are more than 2,000 children in the custody of the U.S. government. The administration contends that among the children in its custody, 46 of the children under five, and more than 1,600 are between 5 and 17 are ineligible for reunification, as such, may never be returned to their parents. With each passing day, we learn more details of the inhumane conditions and abusive treatment some migrant families are enduring at the hands of our government. I, along with a number of other committee members, have personally visited immigration detention facilities to see firsthand how these parents and children are treated. Democrats have sent 6 separate written requests to the administration officials seeking information about how policies are carried out, including how directives were sent to the field for CBP personnel encountering migrant families. As late as a briefing last week, we asked for this same information, and we are yet to receive it. The witness said they had had meetings, but could not provide the written policies for carrying out this zero tolerance. We participated in conference calls and briefings, such as the one I referenced last week with the Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Justice. During the briefing, several members asked a wide range of questions, and we've yet to receive in writing any of the responses to the questions raised. The lack of responsiveness and transparency appears to be a deliberate attempt to keep Congress and the public in the dark about what the Trump administration has done. Without full answers from the Trump administration, we are left to rely on court filings, personal stories, and media accounts. And that's not how this body provides oversight. It's not on the TV that we find out what's going on or in court filings. We're members of Congress. We should be provided this information upon request. This resolution of inquiry is necessary to make sure we have the full picture of what happened to these migrant families, and particularly the children at our border. By requesting documentation over a 2-year time period, we should get a better idea of how families apprehended at the border have been processed over time, the effect of policy shifts resulting from the change of administration, and whatever data the administration may have had to back up its repeated claims that traffickers are passing off children as their own. We should all support getting the facts about what led to this horrible situation. Children are interdicted at the southern border, sent to New York, and families are told that if you want to see your child in California, you have to pay for a plane ticket to send your child to that area. That's not who we are as a country. Parents are given the option of disavowing their children and being deported with the prospect of their children staying here in the United States. That's not who we are. We separated children from their families to start with. We created this crisis, and our job as members of Congress should be to fix it. But you can only fix it with information that we are provided with. This resolution of inquiry asks for that information. I urge all members of this committee to support this resolution of inquiry, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ranking member yields back. Any further discussion on the resolution?
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Ms. Demings is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I am speaking in support of this resolution of inquiry. We do have some serious questions and concerns, and I'm sure you do too, about the Trump administration's policies and procedures regarding families interdicted between ports of entry, and have made numerous requests for more information. It is impossible for Congress as a co-equal branch of government to execute its job effectively without necessary information from DHS. We are the checks and balances on the executive branch. The Trump administration has refused to answer repeated requests for information, including the information sought in Mr. Thompson's resolution of inquiry. Members have written numerous letters seeking information about the children, about parents, children and parents, with no responses. This Homeland Security Committee had a bipartisan briefing last week during which members could ask questions of administration officials. There were several instances in which they denied behavior despite numerous reports from lawyers, advocates, and the media to the contrary. At best, the administration is unaware of the breakdown in communications between agencies, or at worst, this administration is deliberately keeping Congress and the public in the dark about what is happening, what is being done to these migrant families. So again, I'm speaking in strong support of the ranking member's resolution of inquiry on family separation, and with that, I yield back.
Generally yields back. Any further discussion on the resolution? Mr. Keating's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are a committee that prides itself on being bipartisan, and I believe in the last bill that we considered, I demonstrated the ability to do that myself against some of my own party members, and I think this is clearly a resolution where we should all join together in unison about this policy. I want to thank the ranking member for introducing this resolution. The recent actions by the Trump administration and the Justice Department and their zero-tolerance policy have demonstrated this is just an abject failure. Children have been separated, apparently with no formal mechanism to link them back to their parents, and with no plan on how to reunite the families. These are families that fled incredible threats, threats from MS-13. The President's been very clear about MS-13, and even in front of this committee, his officials have been on record as to how violent and dangerous it is to live in the Northern Triangle in places like El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. Under this policy, children as young as 1 year old are forced to defend themselves in immigration courts. parents and sponsors have been forced to pay for reunification costs, $1,500 for plane tickets, when it was the Trump administration who caused the separation in the first place. This policy has also had a significant impact on taxpayers as well. It's up to $40 million so far. Unfortunately, this administration has refused to answer requests for information, including from numerous letters that we have sent. You know, just about a day before the President issued an order to stop the separation policy, the Secretary of Homeland Security said there was no separation policy. It's for this reason that we as a committee with a long history of bipartisanship should require the Department of Homeland Security to hand over any documentation and data in order for us to do our job effectively. I applaud the ranking member for the resolution, and I implore my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this as well. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Mr. Longes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say a few words in support of Ranking Member Thompson's resolution of inquiry, and I thank him for introducing it. As my colleagues have made very clear, the current state of affairs is absolutely unacceptable, and the suffering of parents and their children wrested from their grasp is nothing other than heartbreaking. We need information from the Department, Mr. Chairman, if we are to effectively oversee and expedite the reunification process. In last week's closed-door briefing, which incidentally should have been a public hearing, left me with little confidence that either DHS or HHS is currently doing a good job of reunification of those families. However, just as important in my mind is to understand exactly what happened so that we can ensure that it never happens again. Now, I never thought that I would live in a country, Mr. Chairman, where 3-year-olds were torn from their mother's arms, not in extraordinary circumstances, but as a matter of policy. So, and I'm going to do everything in my power, and I know many of my colleagues agree, that we're going to do everything we can to ensure that we don't see this morally reprehensible actions of the past several months repeated. So let me again thank Mr. Thompson for offering this vital resolution of inquiry. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the resolution?
Mr. Chairman.
Katko.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Well, I understand and I share my colleagues' concerns about this issue about separation at the border. I will note preliminarily that we did have a vote on this in the House as part of a larger immigration bill that was not supported by the majority of the House, unfortunately. But in reading this, I'm going back to my lawyer days. And this would be suppressed in a deposition setting or in a subpoena setting as being overly broad. What this does, I think, is produce so much of a burden on the agency. Every scrap of paper, every note, if I understand this correctly, would have to be transmitted. Every Post-it, which had a little memo on it regarding this, would have to be produced. And I think because of that, that's overly broad. I can't support it. I do support the efforts to oversight, but I don't support the efforts to put such a burden on the agency that it's almost impossible to comply with it. And for that reason, I wouldn't support it. But I do want to commend my colleagues for bringing attention to this matter, but also note that we have had opportunities. We did have a vote on the floor of the House as part of Good Lad 2, which would have stopped this practice at the border once and for all, and made it part of law, and unfortunately that was not supported. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Richmond.
Mr. Chairman, this reminds me of my days in law school where my teacher told me when the facts are on your side, argue the facts. When the facts are not on your side, argue process, or argue technicalities. The fact of the matter is we're in a state in this country right now where we're facing not just a legal but a moral abomination when we start talking about separating children from families. And just today, it was reported that 463 parents have been deported while their kids are still here. At some point, we all learn when we're small that information is power. And at some point, we have to get these kids back to their parents. Most of us in this room are parents. And I would just urge everyone to go back to the days where their kids were infants or toddlers, and just think if they were taken from your custody in your arms, because the one thing you were trying to do is to protect their future and ensure that they would live. And I'm not saying live a great life and that you've signed up to win the lottery, but just so that they can continue breathing. Because you know that if you stay where you are, that the chances are great that they will be killed, they will enter into life with cartels and gangs and drugs. But the one thing you do as a parent is risk it all to provide a better life or better opportunity for your parents. And I will tell you that the other day I sat and I said, you know what? This is America. We're better than that. But the truth of the matter is we're not. We're a country now that has turned our motto, turned all of our beliefs into we have ours. You get yours the best you can. I don't care if your neighborhood is dangerous. I don't care if your kids are going to be killed. But we are here living in America, and we enjoy the luxuries and the rights in this more imperfect or less imperfect union than what it used to be because of the blood, sweat, and tears of many people. But we're sitting here in this great country, and the only thing we care about is our immediate families. We talk about every immigrant as a threat to the homeland in terms of terrorism. We never talk about homegrown terrorism. We won't talk about the radicalization of American citizens. We won't talk about the hate groups. We won't talk about sovereign citizens who are killing more police officers than anybody else, by the way. But it just becomes a point where we're just asking for information on how this decision was made and how can we best help you connect children to their parents. And look, I could take 1,000,000 cheap shots at the administration. I've listened at this committee when 1,000,000 cheap shots was taken at the last administration. But at this point, it's not about taking cheap shots, and I would love to score points and go home and say, oh, I was on CNN. But that's not what this one is about. This one is about common decency. It's about love. It's about parents. And if we can't come together on something like this because it may be overly broad and they need to pass a stick-it note, the question becomes at some point, if this was what we wanted to do, then we would just say, let's tighten up the language. But at some point, common sense has to prevail. And no, we're not asking for Post-it notes. We're asking for information on where are people's kids and where are the parents, and how do we get them in the same place? That's as simple as I think it is, and I commend the chairman, the ranking member for bringing this, because at some point, Dr. King said, at some point, silence becomes betrayal. And if we remain silent, we're betraying this great country and her ideals, which have afforded us all of the luxuries that we have today. With that, I just urge adoption of the resolution.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I commend my colleagues on the other side. Every single one of us wants to get to the facts of this situation. Every single one of us, whether you have kids or not, we understand that America, and certainly as policymakers, every one of us has a responsibility and obligation. These children showed up at our border. We didn't ask them to, but they showed up there, and when they showed up there, we have an obligation to make sure that they're safe and secure. But it seems to me improper to use this situation politically to distort what is really occurring, and we have sought the answers, and it's my recollection, and if anyone can correct me, we just had these folks in last week and sat right down here and asked them every single one of these questions. And one that comes to mind when we talk about the facts here, when somebody says that 463 parents were deported without their children, and the folks that do that work sat right there and told us that none of them were deported without their children unless they requested that. The people being deported requested to leave their children behind. It wasn't the decision of the United States of America or their agents working on the border that did that.
Will the gentleman yield on that point?
I will not, because I heard the man say it. I just want to get through my point here. So, listen, we all want the facts, but it seems to me that we had this discussion this last week. It is now Tuesday? We had this later last week. It's now, we've given them a week or less to get this information, and every single day I get a running account of how many families have been reunited and children reunited, and how many people came with a child that wasn't theirs, and the circumstances about all of them. I think it's appropriate to let the agency do its work and get us the facts, and we'll get the policy right if we have the information. But all we're doing now is trying to force them to spend all their time regurgitating facts instead of doing the work that the court requires them to do, which is put these families back together. That's what they should be focusing on. Get these kids back with their parents. We'll get the information, we'll get the policy right, but it's important that the kids be with their parents, and that we do the right thing here based on the facts. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Payne.
Yes. You know, first of all, well, I'll just say people shouldn't get brownie points for something that they messed up in the beginning. But with that, I'll yield to the ranking member.
The ranking member is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from New Jersey. The point is that this committee has oversight responsibility for the information that we're requesting. You can't do adequate oversight with information. The hearing last week, we asked for information. We don't have it. There are 6 outstanding letters yet to be responded to by this administration, and had it not been for the courts, that's the judiciary. We're the legislative body. We have an oversight responsibility, and I'm saying as a member, we deserve to have that information. I'm not saying whether it's accurate or not, just give us the information. The witnesses that we talked to last week provided nothing in writing. It was all oral. They provided not one piece of paper to us. We did not get it. Well, you say I don't believe them. Now, come on. I'm asking for information. And if they are required by the courts to provide the information because they won't provide it to the Committee of Jurisdiction, it's a problem. And if we want to do our job, then all I'm saying, give us the information. And all of us will have an opportunity to determine whether or not it's accurate. But an oral presentation with no data to back up what you're presenting, not one policy directive was provided to us last week. So I believe the men and women who are doing their job would do a better job if the policies were in writing. They have not provided that to the committee. And I yield to the gentleman from the balance of my time from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
To both of my colleagues, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Perry, I think that part of the discussion, and while I asked the gentleman to yield, was because he mentioned that they told us that all of those parents chose to be separated and leave the kid here as though they were deported. But part of our job is to assess whether, one, it was an informed decision, whether the forms that they signed were in English or whether in their native language. I don't see anything wrong with trying to get to the bottom of how the decision was made, how many of them agreed to it, how many of them didn't understand it. That's what we're here for, and I don't think that it's a question of whether we just take somebody's word for it who's at the table, and I believe that it was during the Obama years that we decided we'd start swearing people in because obviously we didn't believe them. But my comments have nothing to do whether I believe them or not. My comments have to do with how thorough is the process in making sure that people understand their rights and understand what they're actually doing. And if there is a communication barrier, a language barrier that our administration or our Department of Homeland Security didn't take into account, then I think we need to know that. And I think that it's fair to say it could be the case that they all knew exactly what they're doing. But when we're talking about separating families, what's wrong with making sure that they knew exactly what they were doing and that they understood and made an informed decision? And I think that that is what the ranking member's resolution gets to, is making sure that we do our role in terms of oversight to make sure that we're abiding by and living up to the ideals of the country. And with that, I would thank the gentleman for yielding and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Berrigan.
I'd like to speak on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the Secretary of Homeland Security stands up and says there is no separation policy, yet we see something else happening, and we hear accounts of it happening, and then just days later, there's an admission that it happened, you're darn right I'm going to take my job as a member of Congress to do oversight on these agencies. It is outrageous that the briefing we had the other day was not even public. The American people are outraged, and I'm talking about people regardless of party, regardless of color, are outraged that children are being separated at the border. And they want to know what Congress is doing about it. What do I say? Well, geez, we can't even have a public hearing on this. It's a closed session. It's not public. They want to know the answers. They want to hear what happened the other day right here. I sat right here and asked a question about children who were being processed at CBP. They couldn't answer the question what the youngest person is. Why did I ask a question? Because I want to know if kids who are 2 years old can defend themselves in court. Apparently, the administration believes that can be done. When I went down to the south border, we got there and we were told there are no parents at this facility that were separated from their children. That's what I was told. If I just believed it, I would have stopped. But I was actually helping 3 mothers in that facility that were separated from their children. So I challenged them with facts that I had. And all of a sudden, what happened? Oh, well, actually, yeah, there are some parents here that are separated from their children. It's less than 15. So what did I learn in law school? Go and get the facts, get the data. And as the oversight committee here, we deserve to see what those guidelines are and what those policies are. During that visit, what I learned, not from people under DHS, but from the very facility and the folks that were administering these kids, was that there's something called Policy Mondays. On Mondays, they set out guidelines to these different, the Southwest groups, and they're given guidelines on the policy. Why is it that members of Congress cannot see these policies? You can send them out to them, but you can't send them to us for us to look at. There is something very wrong with this. Transparency is something very basic that we are given the duty and the obligation to do. And that is what this is. And that's what is so upsetting to me, is that we can't even do our job because we are not getting the facts and we are not getting the data. Now, the other day, I stood here during the briefing and I asked about parents being charged money to be reunited with their children. I was told point blank, that's not happening. Why are people in my own district, in my constituents, who are being charged thousands of dollars? And it wasn't until immigration groups got involved and they had to basically put up a fight for them to stop that from happening. Why is it that we're getting information? Not because its administration handed it over, not because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle asked for this information to be produced. It's because the courts have forced some information to come out. And through that, we're learning more and more of what wasn't planned. We're learning more and more about this administration not having any plan to keep track of children that they were going to separate from their children. And that's what we're asking for. We are asking for transparency. The last thing I will note is I want to know about the policy of parents being charged to speak to their children. I haven't had anybody tell me whether that was happening or not, other than parents telling me that this is what was going on and why they were not allowed to talk to their children. Now, when I got back, I put in a request directly, and all of a sudden it got done. A woman was able to talk to her child who was being held in New York. It shouldn't take a member of Congress to pick up the phone and ask for that to happen, for a mother to be able to speak to their child. The point here is members of Congress need information to provide the transparency, to provide the oversight. And that's all we're asking for in this resolution, and I support it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion? Ms. Watson-Coleman? No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've tempted me. I was saying I think it's pretty much covered, but I just want to say two things. Number one, I think it's a misrepresentation to have said that the parents want to leave their children here. They've either been coerced or fooled, or they felt like they've had no choice. But as a mother and as a grandmother, you don't ever want your children to be taken away from you. And I just don't think that that is something that we should leave in the thoughts of anyone. And the other thing is that I do not understand why this committee in particular, of all the committees that I've sort of observed and I serve on, is unwilling to just get information. The one thing we have worked together is to ensure that our borders are safe, our systems are fair, and that in a bipartisan manner, we've sought the truth. And so this resolution is simply trying to understand the complexities that seem to have been so ingrained in what has happened with regard to the children and their separation from their families. And I don't understand for the life of me why my friends on the other side of the aisle would think that the seeking of this truth and this information would be a burden on our departments that would supersede the importance of knowing what the truth is. And so in the interest of truth, I would ask my colleagues to support this resolution. With that, I would like to yield the rest of my balance of my time to my ranking member. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'd like to put in the record a copy of a resolution signed by Mr. Perry asking for transparency and oversight with respect to certain issues of Congress. And all I'm trying to do is do exactly what Mr. Perry was trying to do with his sense of with his resolution with Mr. Jordan. You signed on to it. And I want to do the same thing in this resolution that you signed on with Mr. Jordan in that, is get the information. That's all I want. And I'll let the information stand for itself. So I introduce that statement into the record that Mr. Perry joined Mr. Jordan with.
Without objection, so ordered. Any further discussion? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Let me just say first that I and many others on this committee have been on record against the policy of separating families. I'm a father of 5 children, and so I've been very public about my position. And I think it's very important that we conduct our oversight responsibilities under the Constitution, and particularly on this issue. Last Wednesday, I invited officials from DHS, HHS, and the Department of Justice to come brief this committee on the issue of family separations at the border. And it went on for about 2.5 hours. I gave every member as much time as they wanted to question these witnesses. At that briefing, they were asked to follow up in writing with the guidance, policies, and procedures at the border when a family is interdicted. There were many requests made in writing, and the witnesses promised to respond to this committee. On July 19th, I also sent a follow-up letter to the Secretary requesting in writing the information that this committee requested. We will also have the Secretary testify before this committee in the fall. So while I support the spirit of this resolution, I think we all want to conduct oversight. We all want to get this information. To me, it's more the process. The way this usually works is you send a letter to the Secretary in writing, and then you allow them more than just 5 days to respond in writing to the chairman's letter requesting the very information that everybody on this committee wants. A resolution of inquiry is a very extraordinary procedure that would be similar to a subpoena being issued on the department. That's not the way we normally operate. We send a letter first. If the letter is disregarded, then the next step would be to issue a subpoena on the department if the information is not provided. I've been given everything any communication I've had is that they will respond to this letter. And if they don't, then we can take other action. But let's give the department time to respond to a letter request that's requesting everything the ranking member has asked for. So I encourage members to vote yes on reporting this resolution of inquiry to the House with an unfavorable recommendation. And with that, I yield back. Any further discussion?
I'd like to enter into the record those 6 letters that I had reference to with respect to family separation. They go back as far as March 8th of 2017, February 8th, 2018, May 25th, 2018, May 25th again, 2018, June 18th, 2018, June 28th, 2018. It's not just something that's recently happened. None of these letters have been responded to.
And without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? There being no further discussion of the resolution and no amendments listed on the roster, does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, the question now occurs on reporting House Resolution 1005 to the House with an unfavorable recommendation. All is in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All is opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, on that, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 6430, H.R. 6459, H.R. 6438, and H.R. 6461 be considered. Without objection, so ordered, the clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 6430, H.R. 6459, H.R. 6438, H.R. 6461.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed. The bills were circulated and advanced. Printed copies are available. No amendments were pre-filed. Does any member have any amendments to these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 6430, 6459, 6438, and 6461 be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, Mr. King, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Perry, and Mrs. Watson-Coleman may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation. Ms. Watson-Coleman? Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My legislation authorizes the National Deployment Force, or the NDF, an existing entity within the Transportation Security Administration comprised of transportation security officials. The men and women that make up all this all-volunteer workforce go beyond and far and beyond, and oftentimes are forced to leave their homes and families on short notice to support Homeland Security missions. TSA relies on the NDF's rapid response capabilities to support airport screening operations during hiring difficulties, seasonal demands, severe weather conditions, and periods of relief and recovery following a natural disaster or other major event. The NDF has notably been called upon to fill screener staffing gaps at airports where private screening companies operating under TSA's screening partnership program are unable to hire enough officers. The TSA administrator's ability to deploy these trained and experienced officers wherever the need arises underscores a major security benefit of maintaining a cadre of federal and transportation security officers. H.R. 6461, the TSA National Deployment Force Act, will ensure that the good work of the NDF continues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank the Chairman of the Transportation and Protective Security Subcommittee, Mr. Katko, for his collaboration and co-sponsorship, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
General yields. Mr. Perry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6438, the DHS Countering Unmanned Aircraft Systems Coordinator Act, authorizes the Secretary of DHS to designate a countering unmanned aircraft systems coordinator at the department to serve as the lead DHS official for coordinating counter-UAS threat policies and plans. In 2016, the Federal Aviation Administration estimated that there were 1.9 million UAS vehicles, commonly known as drones, in the U.S. This number is expected to grow to a staggering 4.3 million by the end of 2020. The increased availability and expanded use of drones have led to concerns over the potential risk to national security. Drones provide malicious actors both a robust aerial delivery mechanism for potentially hazardous payloads and anonymity in carrying out an attack. This threat is not just imaginary. Known incidents involving drones have included weaponized use by ISIS and cartels, smuggling operations, intrusions at NFL and Olympic stadiums, and damage to electrical grid infrastructure in Canada. H.R. 6438 enables DHS to centralize the coordination of counter-drone threat planning efforts at DHS under one official. Under H.R. 6438, the Countering UAS Coordinator is responsible for coordinating with relevant DHS components on the development of policies and plans to counter threats from UAS. The coordinator will also serve as the principal department official responsible for disseminating information to the private sector regarding DHS counter-drone measures and will ensure that DHS counter-drone activities are carried out in accordance with federal laws. Additionally, H.R. 6438 complements the Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018, introduced last week by Chairman McCall. The Countering UAS Coordinator's role facilitating the implementation of policies and plans made pursuant to the authorities granted by the Chairman's legislation will give the Department the capabilities it needs to effectively protect our homeland against the use of drones for terror. I urge all members to join me in supporting H.R. 6438, the DHS Countering Unmanned Aircraft Systems Coordinator Act, to help DHS coordinate policies and activities relating to countering UAS threats to the homeland. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that a letter from the Small UAV Coalition in support of H.R. 6438, the DHS Countering Unmanned Aircraft Systems Coordinator Act, be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Furthermore, and concluding, H.R. 6430, the Securing the Homeland Security Supply Chain Act of 2018, provides the Secretary of DHS with the proper procurement authorities to take decisive action to protect DHS supply chain when a threat to it has been identified. And I also urge my colleagues to vote in favor of that effort on behalf of Mr. King and myself. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Thompson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For quite some time, you and a number of other members of this committee have expressed concern that the ability for bright ideas somehow gets lost in the maze of bridging the technology maze set up by TSA. So hopefully, with the passage of this bill, we will create an opportunity for medium to small size companies who have expertise not be hamstrung because of the maze that they are required to go through to present that idea for testing, piloting, as well as ultimately procuring. As you know, in the intelligence community, We incentivize that with Incatel and some other things. We need a similar kind of effort at DHS, more specifically with TSA. So we're going to look at how we can study and pilot this within TSA, which is a good way of approaching it. So by pushing TSA to diversify the security technology marketplace, this bill will increase competition and create appropriate incentives for innovation, thus ultimately improving security. And I think you've had some comments about how do we go to a new technology that we know identify a known vulnerability, but we're still stuck over here doing it the old way when we know that there are technologies available, but our protocols just won't let it through the maze. So this is an opportunity to pull that barrier down so that innovation and new ideas can take place. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Let me just conclude. I wholeheartedly agree with what the ranking member said. And I'm also very proud that this committee, as most members are aware, responded to what I consider to be the biggest threat to our aviation sector without getting into the classified space. But now we have appropriated 380 computer tomography machines that will better protect Americans from the explosive and toxic gas threats that we know are out there to airlines. And I'm very proud of that work. I've made it a high priority. It's been a bipartisan effort, and I think ultimately it's going to save American lives. And so this concludes a debate on the bills by the committee for today. As previously announced, requested for recorded votes were postponed. We will recess the committee until 1:30 p.m. when we will vote at that time. The committee stands in recess.
Microphone check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is a microphone check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is the chairman's seat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Well, yeah. Is he coming? Committee will come to order. The committee postponed further proceedings on the recorded vote to the amendment to H.R. 6400 offered by Ms. Berrigan, on which the nays have prevailed by voice vote. The question occurs on the amendment. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Smith. Mr. King. Mr. Rogers.
No.
Mr. Rogers votes no. No. Mr. Barletta. Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Katko. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes no. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes no. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko votes no. Mr. Thompson. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Vila. Mr. Vila votes aye. Mrs. Watson-Coleman. Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes yes. Ms. Rice. Ms. Rice votes yes. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings. Mrs. Deming votes aye. Ms. Barragan. Mrs. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. King. Mr. Thompson. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Richmond. Mr. Payne.
Have all members voted? I'm going to take a brief pause to wait for the ranking member, Mr. Thompson. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his vote? How am I recorded?
Mr. McCall is not recorded.
I vote nay. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 8 yeas and 16 nays.
There being no additional amendments listed on the roster, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 6400 as. You need to write that down. The amendment is not agreed to. There being no additional amendments listed on the roster, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 6400 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Yeah, ranking members recognized.
Wasn't the airplane, but it was something else that kept
We waited, but we have votes on the floor.
Yeah, well, I thank you, and I would have voted aye.
Okay. The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 6400 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes.
Well, what happened to the amendment? We vote? So we have.
Committee postponed further proceedings on the record vote to H.R. 6439 offered by the chairman, on which the ayes prevail by voice vote. The question now occurs on the bill. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Smith. Mr. King.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Barletta. Aye. Mr. Barletta votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Katko. Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes aye. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes yes. Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Ratcliffe votes aye. Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes aye. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
Nay.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Langevin. Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond. Nay. Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Keating. Aye. Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Vila. Mr. Vila votes no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman. Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice. Ms. Rice votes yes. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings. Mrs. Demings votes no. Mrs. Barragon. Mrs. Barragon votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. King. Mr. Payne.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his or her votes? How am I recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye.
The clerk shall report the tally.
The ayes are 20. The noes are 7.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 6439 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Committee postponed further proceedings on the record vote to postponing or reporting H-Res 1005 offered by Mr. Thompson to the House with an unfavorable recommendation on which the ayes prevail by voice vote. The question now occurs on reporting the resolution. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith. Mr. King. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Barletta. Mr. Barletta votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Katko. Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes aye. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes aye. Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Ratcliffe votes aye. Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes aye. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
Nay.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Langevin. No. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Richmond. No. Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Keating. No. Mr. Keating votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Vela. Mr. Vela votes no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman. Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice. Ms. Rice votes no. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes no. Mrs. Demings. Mrs. Demings votes no. Ms. Barragon. Ms. Barragon votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. King. Mr. Payne.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his or her vote? How am I recorded?
The gentleman is not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye.
Clerk shall report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 yeas and 11 noes.
Now, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We made this just in the nick of time before votes on the floor. This
Mr.
concludes
Chairman.
consideration. Ms. Jackson Lee?
I want to be reflected on a vote. Are you trying to close out on the last vote? I want to be reflected on a vote that I was unavoidably detained on.
You may comment on how you would vote.
On the Barragan amendment, I was unavoidably detained. If I had been present in the room, I would have voted aye. I'm sorry that we were gavelled down as I walked into the room to vote, but I'd like the record to reflect that I would have voted aye on the Barragan amendment to H.R. 6400, the United States Port of Entry Threat and Operational Review legislation. Thank you.
Yeah, gentleman, gentlelady yields. Before we conclude, I'd like to
yield back.
I'd like to thank Stephen Geyer, the General Counsel for the majority, for his over 7 years of service on the committee, and before that as an LA to Representative Pete Olson, who served on the committee. Stephen will be leaving us at the end of this month to join Senator John Cornyn's staff on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thank you, Stephen. Where are you? Wish you well. Mr. Rogers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bills reported by this committee today or similar Senate bills. I yield back.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. Ranking member is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. There being no further business to transact, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Just in the nick of time.